Yeah, you're right, Ryan. I did think that this was appropriate time to discuss Canada's productivity crisis. This is obviously a term that's been thrown around a lot. I actually have received several questions in the past about what this means and why it's happening, why it matters. So what this did is this motivated me to write an article, which I posted on LinkedIn about it because I was interested in having an intelligent, well-researched answer to that question. And some of the things I discovered really kind of surprised me. So we're going to get into this Canada's productivity crisis, how are we losing ground, why we're losing ground, and how to fix it. So first of all, why don't we just talk about what productivity is? So at its core, it measures how efficiently we turn inputs like our labor, like our time, machinery and capital into valuable outputs. So put simply, higher productivity means that you are getting more done with the same or with fewer resources. Now let's look at a bit of a comparison. If we looked at advanced economies, labor productivity, for example, in a manufacturing facility can exceed $100 per worker hour. But if we were to look in lower productivity economies like developing nations, this figure is a lot lower. It can be closer to $10 or less. So no matter how hard the lower productivity worker works, they're never going to be able to produce the same amount of output as the higher productivity worker. And they're not going to be able to produce the same types of outputs as well. So what is the reason for this? Well, it doesn't come down to work ethic. It doesn't come down to the lower productivity worker not working as hard. The key difference comes down to access to modern equipment, efficient systems, and skilled labor. So essentially investments that a country conducts over a period of time into making sure that their capital is modern, to making sure that they are up to date on technology, making sure that their workforce and their population are well educated and have access to the types of skills that the economy needs. So why does this matter? Well, higher productivity fuels economic growth. If you want to grow the economy, you can either add more worker hours to the economy, or you can improve productivity, so generate more with each worker hour. I think that most people would agree they would prefer not to have to increase the number of hours they work in order to make more money. They would actually just rather learn how to produce whatever output they're producing or service they're providing more efficiently and effectively, and produce higher wages and more wealth from that. But higher productivity, it means higher standard of living. It means greater investment into public services and generally higher quality of life, because the economy has the ability to invest in things like education, public works, and other forms of important infrastructure. But the reverse is also true. If you have stagnating productivity, or if you have productivity that is in decline, this can erode the standard of living. It can cause wages to be flat or decline over time. And this is essentially creates a cycle whereby if this problem persists for long enough, it becomes harder and harder to reverse it, because you have less resources to reverse it, and you need to actually make a greater investment over a longer period of time just to get back to where you were. So, what does this mean for Canada, and what is Canada's productivity crisis? Well, the reality is that Canada's productivity has been in jeopardy for a significant period of time. Since 2000, Canada's labor productivity has grown at roughly only half the pace of US productivity. So, if we look at a 20-year period from 2021, on average, up to 2021, US productivity growth was about 1.5% per year compared to about 0.5% per year for Canada. But this actually has gotten worse. In the 5 years leading up to 2021, this trend in Canada turned from slow, stagnating productivity to an outright decline, declining on average by 0.3% per year, compared to the US that actually made progress, increasing by 1.7 annually. Now, the United States, which was once seen as our very closest friend and ally, we're now in a situation which is looking more and more adversarial. And we're in a situation where we have to actually consider how we compete against the United States long term. Now, while we should have been considering this for many years, better late than never. But Canada's productivity, in terms of what it will take to turn it around, is an incredibly important ingredient to how we compete with both the United States, but just also in the global community over the upcoming years and decades. Now, if we were to look at just the last 3 years, the situation has actually got even worse. So according to StatsCan, Canada's labor productivity in the last 3 years has fallen by an average of 2.4%. And so as a result, currently, Canadian worker produces only 72% of the output of a US worker for the same amount of time. So we're only 72% as productive here in Canada. And again, the problem is not necessarily the nominal number as much as the trend is going in the negative direction. So this number was 82% going back to the year 2000. So it's gotten significantly worse since then. And it's not just the United States that we've been falling behind as well. On the global stage, the picture hasn't been looking much better. Canada's around mid-pack for advanced economies, trailing not just the United States, but also countries like France, Germany, and Australia. And we're now more closely aligned with the productivity of Italy and Spain. And in fact, only Italy out of this group has experienced a more severe relative productivity decline since the 1980s. So we are losing ground against the United States, but also against other members of the industrialized economy. So what is the cause of this? Well, we had talked before about how the difference between the high productivity worker and the low productivity worker, and the main difference being the high productivity worker had the benefit of investments being made in their economy and in their skills, their training, and their equipment. And this is really where Canada is dropping the ball, is an underinvestment in technology and infrastructure. Now, I know I said that this is topical because it's happening around the time of the election or on the day of the election that I'm actually giving this talk. But my argument here is not that this is necessarily a failure of government, although there are policies that we can point to where the government can do much better. But it's a far broader cause than just that. This comes down to a number of different factors that go outside of government and just comes down to the way that Canadians and Canadian businesses look at risk and look at investing. So overall, if you were to compare Canada versus the United States, this is for 2023, the investment for every dollar that US companies invested into machinery and equipment for their workers, Canadian companies only invested 41 cents. So relatively 41% of the investment. And when we look at intellectual property products like technology, that number is even worse. Canadian workers only got 30 cents for every dollar that the American workers got in terms of investment. And again, this is the same when we compare ourselves to other developed countries. So compared to the OECD average, our total R&D investing as a share of GDP is well under the average, 1.9% compared to 2.7% for the OECD average and 3.5% for the United States. So in 2021, US firms in advanced technology sectors spent 103 times more on R&D than their Canadian counterparts. So this is in spite of the fact that the US is about 12 times the size. So when we adjust for size, that means that Canadian businesses are investing only about 11% of US level R&D. Now this is a big problem. And the question is, what is causing this? So as I had mentioned before, there are a number of issues. We can look to policy, but I want to look beyond that. I want to look to something that is more universal across Canada. And that's that Canadians tend to have culturally a more risk-averse nature relative, at least to Americans. So unlike the United States, where bold ventures and high-stakes innovation are often encouraged, even celebrated, Canadian firms tend to prioritize stability, predictability, and incremental change. So there's growing evidence that this is the case, and I've actually referenced in my article several studies on it. A couple of them include the Conference Board of Canada. They did a study, this was in 2024, describing the country as having a risk-averse innovation culture and assigning it low marks on critical technology adoption. There is an article in Policy Options. This is a little bit older, but it highlighted how Canadians' risk aversion correlates with the lower R&D spending and investment, and that Canadian companies have a tendency to cling to older techniques. as well, Deloitte put out a report surveying 1,200 Canadian business leaders, and they found that only 11% of the companies could be considered courageous, meaning willing to embrace significant change or take on calculated risks. So this is obviously an issue that anybody in the business community in Canada has probably discovered themselves. Now, I can think of my own example in the investment finance space, in the equity research space. This is related to how we get information on public companies. So the government database that provides this information is called CDAR. The equivalent in the United States is called EDGAR. So ever since I started in investment research, which was over 20 years ago, EDGAR in the United States has been a very modern system that provides multiple ways of accessing data, both in PDF or HTML, or also programmatically through an API so that you can connect it to computer systems. Now, you compare that to Canada and the CDAR system, and it always, for 20 years of working in equity research, been the same archaic system that didn't provide any type of digital access to financial data that was widespread across the companies. Rather, it was just one way of accessing data, which was through PDF, and that makes it very difficult to do anything. Well, just a couple of years ago, they upgraded that system, and I was a little bit excited of what they could actually do with it. But even after 20 years, they upgraded it, and it really is just as archaic and hard to use, perhaps even more so than it was. So that's just one example in my industry of how Canada has just not kept pace with making sure that they're at the cutting edge when it comes to technology and innovation. But many people that have experience dealing with US businesses versus Canadian businesses will often report that in the United States, there is more of a tendency to be competitive and to make bold decisions, and to embrace innovation and embrace calculated risk and just make decisions. Whereas in Canada, the tendency is more towards risk aversion and taking a long time to mull over decisions, and then ultimately not move towards the direction of calculated risk. So how do we reverse this trend? What can businesses do? Well, to the extent that culture is the issue, and again, there are many things that could be attributed to this issue. It's a very complex situation. It's not just, we can't simplify it by just saying that it's one thing. But to the extent that culture is a contributing factor, the power to change this is within all of us. So what can businesses do? Well, the first thing a business should do is make an effort to benchmark their productivity levels and investment relative to industry and global standards. And to the extent that there is a significant gap, to evaluate why that gap exists, and then plan incremental improvements towards reducing that gap. That doesn't mean knee-jerk, large movements, large reactionary movements right away, but rather incremental movements that embrace the idea of calculated risk, and also provide a learning experience in terms of how to become a more risk-forward or calculated risk-forward business. And then also just fostering a culture that supports innovation and encourages the sharing of new ideas. And then, of course, individuals also have a part. That includes continuous learning, taking the initiative to upskill through courses and certifications, and other types of resources. And then looking for opportunities to implement new tools and technologies, such as AI, into your own existing workflows. Also encouraging other people in your organization that are trying to do that. So in conclusion, the productivity crisis that we hear about, it's not just an economic stat. This is a real risk that does threaten the nation's future prosperity and way of life. The root causes, again, are very complex, but no country should expect to maintain strong productivity while underinvesting the way that Canada has. Now, to the extent that culture plays a role, we can all contribute to that solution, and everybody has a part to that solution. It's not just the government; it's also private business, and it's also individuals. So that concludes my article. If any of you have any comments.
Awesome.
Yeah.
One thing that I would like to say is that, we ended up putting out a telecommunications special report earlier this year. And I ended up when I was doing my kind of broad industry overview, I came across a nice research report by PwC that's called "Driving Canada's Productivity: The Impact of the Telecom Sector and Its Role in Improving Productivity." And when I was reading it here, it was basically kind of talking about, like, I'll kind of quote some of the conclusion here. It says, the impact of an unhealthy telecom sector where telecoms lack adequate free cash flow to fund investment in connectivity impacts not only the industry itself, but also the broader economic productivity of the country. When telecoms cannot advance connectivity, the quality and availability of digital infrastructure becomes limited and decreases relative to other countries. They go on to, highlight some of the things here. They say, in the future, the Canadian telecom sector will continue to contribute significantly to Canadian GDP and jobs, positively impact revenues across industries, yada, yada. However, recent trends could potentially reduce the capacity of the sector to make ongoing investments in network infrastructure, including, interest rate increases are raising debt costs, as well as, just this is limiting the available funds for investment. So, if anyone's interested, again, that's called the Driving Canada's Productivity: The Impact of the Telecom Sector and Its Role in Improving Productivity. Thought it was a pretty good research report that they put together. But yeah, it just shows, just the free cash flow from, our telecoms has been dwindling over the past few years, kind of leading to some of this stagnation in investment as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I believe that hurts this country is the way some of our biggest industries are structured and have been protected, and that would include the telcos, to like dovetail off of that. The airlines and the banks, they're oligopolies. They don't have the incentives to innovate. They're insulated from competition, and that would drive a lot of profitability to me. I mean, you just, I you have, like, we fly all the time. We have two airlines that we can really choose from, and 90% of the time, half the time they're hideous. But you have no choice to go anywhere else. The banks, they still use old systems. Like, it's hard to even transfer money between like a brokerage account and your main just checking account. Like the systems that are in place, if they faced significant more competition, those things have to be innovated. But in this case, I think that leads to less innovation and lack of profitability. I would agree with Aaron that risk aversion generally in our culture is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And there is, a declining Canadian dollar over time makes capital equipment, importing it, more expensive, thereby discouraging investment. And that's with a lower dollar, particularly when we're butting up against the US, which, it costs them less money to buy an NVIDIA chip or, things that can create innovation, particularly in tech. And then the tax structure, higher capital gains. They were just on the table for the Liberals. Now they've been pulled back. But, why set up a tech company in Canada where you can innovate and become more productive, where you can? It's harder to attract the best talent in those companies because of a poorer tax structure. Now, there is some states in the U.S. where, the capital gains rate is actually higher, right? But then there's 50 states. So there's some that are significantly lower than the low end that you can pay in Canada. So, you can set up shop there and it gives them a tax advantage. And we don't seem to be completely aware of that. I mean, we are aware, but we just poo-poo it. The governments, I don't think they really, if you really want to be a leader in tech, set it up so you have a tax advantage situation. It wouldn't have to be a crazy low tax rate. Just make it, you're in competition with the US. And then to our industries, those oligopolies, open up some competition. I'm not sure what we're afraid at. Like, I get in the banking industry, we need the regulation, but just make sure everybody that comes in is regulated as well, to the degree that the banks here are. So anyways, that's my soapbox on it. But it creates good discussion.
I'll just add on your capital gains. The interesting difference between Canada and the US for our capital gains is they have short-term capital gains, which are taxed at a higher rate as well.
True.
So they actually push you toward if you want to get that taxable benefit to hold over a year. So,
which I think is great, to be honest.
That
structure
aligns with us, obviously.
Yeah, it certainly aligns with us. Like if you're looking to, and there were some proposals made by candidates in this election to roll over Canadian companies. In if you made a gain in TSX listed XYZ, and then you roll that over into TXS listed ABC, there's no capital gain, and that can compound over time. I think that's a great way to keep you invested in Canadian companies as well. You don't do that just to stay in a Canadian company. You got to find the best companies to invest in. But if it happens to align, I think it's great. Maybe that will come to fruition. We'll see what goes on. There's people voting today.
Yeah,
so we'll see.
And that's the thing. Like I brought that up to a bunch of people, that they're planning on getting rid of the cap gains if you're rolling it over into another, TSX listed or Canadian company. And I got like a lot of people like that would say, oh, but you're taxed eventually. Well, yes, you are, but it's the tax-free compounding that is, growing. Like people need to understand the
well, there's also just a lack of education on anything to do with tax. And then our tax system too is sometimes more complicated in the US. We have the inclusion rate on the capital gains, and people think you're taxed at 50%. It's actually just the include. Like I go into a forum on taxes in Canada versus the US, and it's just the lack of knowledge. And I sympathize, because it can be the gross up on dividends. People are like, what the hell is that? And it's just, can we not simplify things? We can, but they seem to try to make it complicated. And it's complicated just for the average person. And it makes it hard. Like, why would I invest? They don't know the difference between getting interest income and dividend income. And that should be, you should know that the dividend income is treated far better, but it's just, again, it's because it's complicated. But anyway.